Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our presentation today on Vienna, the City of Music, which is part of the Rhine Week that Viking is presenting. Well, my name is Angela Schneider, and I'm a professional musician. I play viola with the Vancouver Symphony. And our symphony season is about 40 weeks long. For the rest of my off weeks, I lecture on cruise ships about music, culture, culinary history, and history. Now, because I studied and lived in Germany for 10 years before cruise ship speaking took up all my time, I used to lead and organize classical music tours to Europe. Our tours would always have a theme, something like In the Footsteps of Mozart, and we'd go to a lot of local concerts. And during the course of these tours, I'd tell the guests about the musicians and the music that we'd be hearing. Now, one of the cities that was frequently included on the tours was Vienna, and with good reason. Steeped in centuries of musical history, many of the world's most famous composers gravitated to this remarkable mecca for the arts, and there are still so many venues where one can go to hear a concert. There are 65,000 tickets for sale every evening for various performances, and some concert halls here are legendary. Brahms, Mahler, Schoenberg, and their buddies had world premieres of their works at places like the Musikverein and the Konzerthaus. When you visit the Mozart House, you can explore the flat where Mozart lived, and you can attend a concert in the very hall where Mozart himself played. So it's all quite magical. And as you can imagine, having the opportunity as a musician to visit this city is to live in the spirit of all those great composers, intellectuals, and artists who have left their footprints in the streets of Vienna. And that goes actually for anybody who appreciates music, museums, galleries, and very interesting architecture. Well, in the next 80 minutes, I'm going to briefly go over Vienna's history and tell you why it became a center of the arts. We're going to find out what the Viennese School of Music actually is, and I'm going to tell you about 4 composers who made Vienna their home. Well, even narrowing it down to 4 won't allow for an in-depth look of their lives and music, not in this time frame. So I did pick one composer to be our main focus, and that composer is going to be Mozart. Well, Vienna started life as a battle-scarred Roman frontier town, and until well into the 12th century, it sat virtually on the Hungarian border. In the 9th and 10th century, the fierce Magyar horsemen of Hungary frequently carried out devastating raids against Central Europe until the Hungarian army was finally annihilated by the German forces of King Otto the Great in 955. Otto created a new March of the East. A march simply means a buffer zone, and that was to keep his kingdom from further Hungarian incursions. In Germany, this area was called Ostarrîchi, or Eastern Realm, and from that we get the word Austria. The Eastern March was ruled by the Babenbergs. This was a wealthy Bavarian dynasty, and they expanded their duchy to include Lower and Upper Austria and Vienna. The Babenbergs moved their residence to Vienna in the mid-12th century, making the city their capital and one of the principal cities of the Holy Roman Empire. Well, when the male line of the Babenbergs came to an end in 1246, the House of Hapsburg set out to acquire the former Babenberg lands. A century later, Habsburg rule and Habsburg territories were known as the Austrian domains, and the Habsburg Duke became one of the most influential territorial lords in the region. In 1452, the first Habsburg was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Well, in case anybody's not quite sure what this Holy Roman Empire is, it was sort of a bizarre entity which comprised most of the German-speaking countries from the North and Baltic Seas down to the Alps. And its emperor was the spiritual descendant of Caesar and Charlemagne, but he in fact possessed very little power. The hereditary domains that made up the Austrian or Hapsburg Empire was itself a multinational patchwork stitched together over the centuries by intermarriage, by inheritance, military conquest, and pure luck. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was continuously occupied by the Habsburgs from 1440 until the empire came to an end in 1806. The Habsburg Emperor decided to make Vienna the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, and it became his main residence. Later, when the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, Vienna stayed as the capital of the newly founded Austrian Empire, which later turned into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all of it still under the rule of the Hapsburg Dynasty. Well, we fast forward now to the 18th century and the Age of Enlightenment, where influential thinkers started to question the traditional authority and the divine right to rule of the monarchs. Some of the 18th century rulers, like Frederick the Great, saw themselves as enlightened despots, where the monarch would still have absolute power, but he saw it more as a social contract where his people entrusted him or her, because Catherine the Great was also an enlightened despot, so the public would entrust them with the power to govern in the public's best interest. The concept is best summarized by Habsburg Emperor Joseph II, quote, "Everything for the people, nothing by the people," end quote. The monarchs cultivated the arts at the highest level and without regard to cost in an effort to shape their countries into ideal societies. Rulers vied with one another in the size, distinction, and expense of their artistic establishments. The Austrian Empire took great pride in its prolific and prestigious production of music. So concerts and dancing became a hugely important part of Viennese life and culture. In Vienna, craftsmen specialized in the creation of musical instruments. Opera houses were built and sheet music publishing houses flourished. The Hapsburg Dynasty sponsorship, along with the generous patronage of the imperial court's aristocrats and a rising middle class who bought tickets to musical performances, created a lucrative environment for artists and for musicians. Well, if you were a musician with talent and ambition and you wanted to make it to the big league, Vienna was the place to be. A steady stream of composers and musicians flocked to Vienna to establish themselves. In fact, more famous composers have lived in Vienna than any other city in the world, though few of them were born there. The era of music roughly spanning the 18th century is today called the Classical era, and it had a distinct musical style that was different from the Baroque period which preceded it. Baroque, you think of the music of Bach and Handel, and the Romantic era which followed it, which was defined by dramatic, emotional music in which an artist bears their soul. Think Tchaikovsky, for instance, or Berlioz. The leading composers of the classical period are Haydn, Mozart, partly Beethoven, and peripherally Schubert. Collectively, historians call these composers the first Vienna school. Composers of the classical period strove to create works with a clean, balanced sound and a lighter texture, something that would appeal to the greatest number of people. The melodies are usually simplified and they're supported by a moving harmony. So in layman's language on a musical level, it means that you can hum along to a tune of Mozart far more easily than from Handel or Bach. And if anyone's tried to sing the Messiah, you'll know what I mean. Well, instruments, especially the piano, also changed in this period. Orchestras got bigger and they looked more like the orchestras that we see in concert halls today. String quartets emerged and there were innovations in opera. Well, of course, people living during that musical period didn't think of themselves as composing Baroque or classical works. It was just music. People would go to the latest performance of the symphony, concertos, or operas, just as you might go to a rock concert today. And as a matter of fact, in most concerts, all of the music would be new. The first great composer of the Viennese classical school was Joseph Haydn. Well, for many historians, the era of classical music begins with Haydn's compositions of the 1750s. Haydn was born in 1732 in the small Lower Austrian village of Rohrau. Well, neither of his parents could read music, but the family sang together, and his parents noticed that their son was musically gifted. There was no musical training in Rohrau, so the 6-year-old was sent to live with a relative in Hainburg to train as a musician. At 8 years of age, young Haydn caught the attention of the musical director of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. He moved to Vienna in 1740 and sang in the choir until his angelic voice broke at age 16. Hapsburg Empress Maria Theresa famously said, quote, "That boy doesn't sing, he crows." Well, the choir master at St. Stephen's had suggested that Haydn become a castrato so he could keep his nice, light, high voice. But his father objected, and the operation never went ahead. Haydn instead became a freelance musician, working as a music teacher, a street serenader, and eventually in 1752 as valet accompanist for the Italian composer Niccolò Porpora, from whom he said he learned the true fundamentals of composition, because, in fact, Haydn had not received any systematic training in music theory or in composition. In 1753, his first opera premiered, and this was a comedic work called Der neue krumme Teufel, which translates as the new limping devil. Even the title is kind of hilarious. And though the music for it is lost, it was good enough to get noticed, and it helped him to get an aristocratic patron, which was the key to success for any composer in the mid-18th century. Haydn wrote his first string quartet for a wealthy music amateur, the Baron von Fellenberg, who gave concerts in his country home near Vienna. Well, Haydn would eventually write 68 string quartets, and they're the standard by which all other classical string quartets were and are judged. No less an expert than Mozart said that it was from Haydn that he learned how to write quartets. The patron with whom Haydn's name would be indelibly connected were the princes Esterhazy, initially Paul Anton, and when he died, his younger brother, Prince Nicholas, who placed Haydn in charge of most of the Esterhazy musical establishment. Well, according to his contract, it was Haydn's responsibility to lead all rehearsals and performances, whether orchestral or chamber, with no time off other than allowed at the discretion of the prince. Well, all music that he produced while employed at this court became the property of Prince Esterhazy, to such an extent that Haydn was forbidden to give away copies of his own compositions to any other person. Finally, no matter how frustrated or overworked he was, he could never resign without the explicit permission of the prince. His contract also said that he was expected to set an example to the musicians under him by, quote, conducting himself in an exemplary manner, abstaining from undue familiarity and from vulgarity in eating, drinking, and conversation. When the orchestra performed, Haydn had to make sure that they all appeared in white stockings, white linen, and with a powdered pigtail or tie wig. And the contract had another 3 pages along those lines. So from a 21st century perspective, this was not a great employment contract, but it was standard for the time in which Haydn lived. In becoming the Esterhazy's Kapellmeister, which means the music master, Haydn gave up his dreams of personal freedom, but he was probably happy to have a steady income and a comfortable home. The remoteness of the Esterhazy did leave him feeling isolated and lonely. He writes, quote, "I can never obtain leave, even for 24 hours, to go to Vienna. I am doomed to stay at home, a poor creature, plagued perpetually by hard work and with few hours for recreation," end quote. He stayed with the Prince Esterhazy for 30 years, and the position gave him the resources, musical and financial, to compose as much music as humanly possible. His compositions attracted attention, and by 1766, the Vienna Daily News included him among the most distinguished musicians of Vienna, writing, "His music has beauty, purity, and a delicate and noble simplicity, which commends it to every listener." From 1770 onwards, Haydn expanded his musical horizons, writing larger and more original works. He renegotiated his contract in 1779. So instead of his compositions being the property of the Esterhazy family, he was permitted to write for others and to sell his work to publishers. He sold his works to multiple publishers, both Austrian and foreign, and he switched to composing more quartets and symphonies, works that were easier to sell to the public rather than big choral works or opera. His reputation spread throughout Austria, and important commissions began arriving from abroad, like the 6 symphonies commissioned by the Count of Agny in Paris. Well, Haydn was now in the paradoxical, if not bizarre, position of being Europe's leading composer, while still spending his days as a duty-bound Kapellmeister in the remote palace in the Hungarian countryside. Well, his career at the Esterhazy finally came to an end with the death of Prince Nikolaus in 1790. The prince's musically indifferent son and successor Anton dismissed the entire orchestra, keeping only the few members necessary for the carrying on of church services. Haydn was now free to go to Vienna, where he was immediately approached by a well-known impresario of the day, Johann Peter Salomon, who offered him a generous contract to go to London to write an opera, symphonies, and other works. Haydn would be paid £500 for writing 6 symphonies, of which Salomon would have the copyright, and an additional £200 for 20 new compositions and 20 concerts, which Haydn would have to produce. Well, on this first trip, because he did go a second time later on, he made about $250,000 in today's currency, which was considerably higher than his court salary. Before he left for London, he said farewells to the other great composer of the classical era who was living in Vienna, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Well, they had met in Vienna around 1784. They had played quartets together in Mozart's apartment, and despite a 24-year age difference, they had formed a very close friendship based on mutual respect and admiration. 3 years before this farewell meeting, Haydn had written, quote, "I only wish I could impress upon every friend of mine, and on great men in particular, the profound appreciation which I myself feel for Mozart's inimitable music. Well, then nations would vie with each other to possess such a jewel. It enrages me to think that the unparalleled Mozart is not yet engaged by any imperial court." Mozart would affectionately address Haydn as Papa, and he dedicated his 6 Haydn quartets to his older friend instead of the usual patron or sponsor. Well, as they said their goodbyes in December 1790, tears welled in both men's eyes. Haydn was already 58, and traveling long distances at that age was risky. Mozart said, "We are probably saying our last farewell in this life." And he was right, but neither man imagined that it would be the 34-year-old Mozart who would be dead a year later. Well, in London, Haydn wrote his last 12 symphonies for performance there, and they were a huge success. These last symphonies are among the form's masterpieces, with daring, harmonic movements, rhythmic drive, memorable themes, and a larger orchestra. More than any other single composer, it was Haydn who created the classical era symphony. He was the one who came up with the standard symphony format, this four-movement structure, which you'll be familiar with if you've ever been to a concert. A symphony starts with a fast sonata form movement, then you get your second movement, which is a slow movement, then a minuet and trio, and finally a fast finale. Well, the evolution of Haydn's string quartets parallels that of his symphonies. Remember, he wrote 68 of them. And since his day, the string quartet is considered the true test of a composer's art. Haydn made two lengthy trips to England and was celebrated as the greatest composer of his time. He returned to Vienna in 1795 as a financially secure international celebrity. He lived until the age of 77, composing and performing almost until the end. So we're going to listen to an excerpt from his 94th symphony, nicknamed The Surprise. Well, Haydn was known for his personal love of practical jokes, and he interjects that sense of humor into his symphonies. In London, where the work was written, his audience, fresh from the dinner table, would often be heard snoring during the slow movements. So he decided to insert a sudden loud chord which jarred the audience members awake, and he loved to watch as they jumped up in their seats. Well, Haydn was the superstar of his time. Although Mozart did become well known and highly esteemed during his lifetime, he did not reach celebrity status until long after his death. However, both men's celebrities, especially Mozart's, so completely overshadow every other composer of the classical period that the average concert goer probably couldn't name anybody else from this time period. I mean, how many people know about the Viennese native Karl von Dittersdorf, or one of Vienna's most popular composers in Mozart's time, Franz Hofmeister? Well, probably not a lot of you unless you play viola, because Hofmeister wrote one of the few viola concertos that we have in our repertoire from that period, so we do know about him. But what was it about Mozart and his music that made him the legend that he is? Well, when the classical music period starts, roughly between 1730 to 1750, musicians were, by definition, servants. They wore servants' livery, and they ate in the service kitchen along with the cooks and the scullery maids. They were never allowed to travel without their employer's permission, and even the most talented had little chance of making it as a self-employed musician. Their best bet was to get into a court orchestra, which Leopold Mozart, a respected composer and a fine violinist, had managed to do in the Salzburg Court Orchestra. Salzburg was a tiny, independent city-state, sandwiched uncomfortably between Austria and neighboring Bavaria. It was an ecclesiastical domain administered by prince archbishops, who were generally indifferent to their subjects. Leopold was intelligent and ambitious, and he very much wanted to climb above the low social status as fourth violinist in the orchestra. On the evening of January 27th, 1756, his wife gave birth to her seventh child, only one of which had so far survived infancy. The birth registry recorded the infant's name as Johannes Chrysostomus Wolfgangus Theophilus, though his family affectionately called him Wolfel, or which is what English would be the equivalent of Wolfie. Well, the stories of his remarkable early talent are well known. At 3, after watching his older sister, who was nicknamed Nanel, get keyboard lessons from their father, he would also spend hours at the keyboard picking out chords. At 4, he could play a number of short pieces flawlessly from memory, and he started writing them down for himself. By 5, he was composing. Well, neither of Leopold's children received any formal schooling. Both of them were educated at home, and that, of course, included their musical training. Wolfgang seemed to be able to learn the most difficult things just by observing. For example, how to play the violin. Now, I know how difficult that is because I've taught a lot of beginners, and it takes weeks and weeks before you can even get a decent sound out of the instrument. So let me set the scene. His father and friends from the orchestra were sight-reading quartets one evening, and Wolfgang, age 5, insisted on sitting in and playing second violin. Well, Leopold told the boy to stop nagging the grown-ups. I mean, he'd had no instruction on violin, and it was absurd to think that he could just pick it up and play along with the adults. Wolfgang insisted that he didn't need any lessons to play second violin. So Leopold relented, and as his friend relates, little Wolfie's fingering may have been incorrect and improvised, but he could play not just the second violin, but the first violin part as well, and he never got stuck. I mean, that is truly extraordinary. And apparently Leopold had tears running down his cheeks. He was so amazed and so happy. Leopold, of course, hadn't just fallen off the turnip truck. He knew that he had a pair of potential stars on his hands, and he determined to take his 2 musical sensations on tour to the courts of Europe. It dawned on him that the phenomenal gifts Nanel and especially Wolfgang were exhibiting could be his ticket out of Salzburg. So Leopold requested leave from court duties. As he explained to the Archbishop, quote, "There is a miracle ordained by God in the town of Salzburg, and if it ever be my humble obligation to convince the world of this miracle, the time is now." End quote. Well, unspoken in all of this was Leopold's quest to find a well-paying post for Wolfgang and himself so that he could get out of provincial Salzburg. In September 1762, they went to Munich and then Vienna, where the children gave a concert for Empress Maria Theresa in Schönbrunn Palace. It was a smashing success, and soon they were in high demand, doing 2 to 4 performances per day. Wolfgang entertained the audience by playing piano, improvising, by sight reading, singing, and composing on the spot. For example, he'd write a bass line for a melody that he was given. He also did tricks such as playing on a keyboard covered with a cloth or naming the pitches of bells, clocks, even pocket watches. Although his schedule was grueling and Wolfgang fell ill with scarlet fever, he loved the attention. And his dad loved the money, the jewelry, and the expensive clothing that they were given. When the family returned to Salzburg in January 1763, he was able to bank the equivalent of more than 2 years of his salary. Well, after a lifetime of scrimping and saving, the parents realized without a doubt that their children, particularly Wolfgang, were their ticket to fame and to fortune. In mid-1763, Leopold obtained a leave of absence again, and this time the family spent 3 years on the road, playing to nobility in 7 different countries, 88 different cities. Well before his 10th birthday, Wolfgang was the family's principal breadwinner. In 1767, after 3 years on the road, Leopold reluctantly returned to Salzburg to show the court how his young Wunderkind had improved. As he toured Europe, Wolfgang was learning to write music from the leading composers of his day. From the start, his music is astonishingly well written. The young Mozart shows an uncanny ability to mimic the styles and the forms of the day, but with flashes of individuality. Leopold knew that his children's marketability depended on their youth, so after a mere 9 months, they were off again to Vienna, where they stayed for the next 16 months. When they finally returned to Salzburg in January 1769, Wolfgang, now pushing 13, had already written 10 symphonies, 2 operas, 18 sonatas for piano and violin, 3 masses, and other religious choral works, and that's not even the complete list. But still, there were no offers for a court position from the nobility that they had met so far. So Leopold convinced himself that Italy was where his son's destiny lay. Between 1769 and 1773, Mozart and his father toured Italy 3 times. The operas that he wrote in Italy were a success, and Italy was quite taken with him. But again, no position was offered. So back to Salzburg it was, where inconveniently for the Mozarts, a new archbishop called Colloredo was installed. Archbishop Colloredo was a fiscal conservative with little interest in music, and he was not prepared to cut the Mozarts any more slack. He did not want a vice Kapellmeister who was never at his post. The Mozarts had done their job as roving ambassadors for Salzburg, raising its prestige, and now Colloredo said it was time to reap the rewards. Colloredo kept Mozart very busy with commissions. In the year 1773 alone, Mozart, still only 17, wrote, among other things, 7 symphonies, 11 chamber music works, and his first piano concerto. And it was during this period that he found his compositional voice, that he stopped being an imitator and began to transcend his contemporaries, entering a whole new place where the other classical composers were simply unable to go. Well, because music just seemed to pour out of Mozart, a common myth is that he was simply a vessel for divine inspiration, God's stenographer, an idiot savant, effortlessly transcribing the music that just played up in his brain. But that myth does Mozart a terrific disservice. Mozart was not a born composer, any more than Michael Jordan was a born basketball player. A closer study of Mozart's surviving sketches and drafts, many of which were thrown away after his death, shows that he seemed to have refined his ideas to an almost manic degree. He would sometimes begin a piece, set it aside, and resume it months or years later. He rewrote passages several times in a row, and he'd start movements from scratch when a first attempt didn't satisfy him. So in a way, he was writing his works all the time. And yes, he did work a lot of it out in his head before he started writing. But he worked at it like everybody else or like every other composer. And if he had died at the age of 10, and he came very close many times to dying in his childhood, we wouldn't even be talking about him today. He was a perfectionist who worked incredibly hard at his craft. As a matter of fact, his wife insisted he had worked himself to death. Mozart started his apprenticeship early, so that by the age of 20, when other composers were still learning their craft, he was a fully realized composer. His genius was to assimilate all the musical styles that he had heard while abroad and turn them with seemingly no effort into the most enchanting, divine works of music that anyone had ever heard. Between 1773 and 1777, 5 years when he was working full-time in Salzburg, he wrote so much great music that we could spend the rest of this presentation just talking about that. But I'll zero in on one work that he wrote at the age of 21, and it was a piano concerto written for the newfangled forte piano, which was the transitional instrument between the harpsichord and the modern piano. Well, unlike the harpsichord, you could get a piano or a quiet sound and a forte or a loud sound, depending on how hard you hit the keys. Now, if you've ever heard a harpsichord, you'll know it's got a completely different sound, and it has got a quill which plucks at a string when you hit the key. So once that string has been plucked, that's it. And no matter how hard you hit the key, you won't make it louder or softer. But in this case, with this pianoforte, you could now do that. So from the second bar of the concerto, as we can see from the slide, Mozart did something completely new, which must have shocked the opening night audience. You can see the first bar and the second line, the orchestra comes in first, but then the piano comes in right after that opening bar and completes the phrase, which breaks with the practice of every other concerto written in the classical period, which always had a long introduction by the orchestra. So right from the start, the piano and orchestra are equal partners in a genuine dialogue. And this is the first time in history that this happened in a concerto. Let's have a listen. Highly regarded symphonies, concertos, operas, and chamber works. He was widely acknowledged as the greatest pianist and harpsichordist of his time, and he was also a first-class violinist and conductor. And he wanted nothing more than to get out of the backwater of Salzburg. Mozart was now just as eager as his father to find an official position more appropriate to his genius and his proven accomplishment. Neither had a good word to say for the city, despite the fact that their requests for leaves had been accommodated for 15 years and then abused by overstaying and shamelessly soliciting positions abroad. And I always find it a bit amusing that when you go to Salzburg, everything is Mozart, 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 including Mozart candies and postcards and everything. And yet he hated this city, and all he ever wanted to do was to leave it. Well, in early August 1977, Leopold had Wolfgang submit another request for a leave of absence, though it's clear that the letter itself was written by Leopold. It was never Leopold's plan that his son alone should find a position. He envisioned an arrangement in which he too would be honored with a post at the same establishment, even though his son would be the chief breadwinner for the whole family, which would continue to thrive and function as a closely knit unit, with Leopold, by divine right, at its head. Well, the whole purpose of parenting in the 18th century was to find a niche for your children in, well, to use today's term, the socio-economic system, so that they could support themselves and later on support you when you became too old to work. Well, it was a cycle. Your family sent you forth, prepared to take your place in the world. That was their duty. But the Archbishop was having none of it, and he fired them both. Leopold went into shock because he was not only without a job for the first time in his life, but his son had also been ignominiously fired. Leopold suffered weeks of anguish and disgrace before throwing himself upon the Archbishop's mercy and pleading to get his job back. Wolfgang, on the other hand, was free to go and do what he liked, though Leopold insisted that the boy's mother had to accompany him, with it being understood that Mom was to report back on Wolfgang's every move, especially if it were concerned romantic entanglements, which his dad thought would be the most dangerous threat to his career. They were gone for over a year, first to Munich, where the elector politely declined to offer Mozart a post. Then Mannheim, same story. Then Paris. The correspondence with his father over the 16 months shows how Wolfgang increasingly felt the need to free himself from paternal domination, while Leopold's anxieties about their future assumed almost pathological dimensions. It was Leopold who fostered the image of his son as an eternal child, because Leopold's sense of self was wrapped up as being the shepherd to God's miracle, and for a long time his son obliged him. Mozart disliked Paris from the start, and Paris was indifferent to him. The lowest point came when his mother died, and Leopold made it clear that he held his son responsible for her death. Yet he also understood that now he needed his son more than ever. He demanded that Wolfgang return to Salzburg, where through equal parts sniveling, begging, and bullying, Leopold had managed to obtain for his son an appointment as court organist. Dragging his feet, Wolfgang headed back home. However, 18 months later, in March of 1781, he was summoned to Vienna. Archbishop Colloredo was attending the celebrations for the accession of Joseph II to the Austrian throne. They stayed here in the Deutsches House, which I mentioned earlier, and now Mozart saw his chance to leave Salzburg for good. He wrote to his father, quote, "My main goal right now is to meet the emperor in some agreeable fashion. I am absolutely determined that he should get to know me. I would be so happy if I could whip through my opera for him and then play a fugue or two, for that's what he likes." Colloredo, though, kept him on a short leash. He was expected to eat with the servants. He was forbidden to concertize on his own, and when the Salzburg musicians were asked to perform Prince Galitzin's house, Colloredo instructed Mozart to wait outside in the hallway with the other household musicians until they were called in. The other musicians didn't dare disobey, but Mozart knew these nobles. He had known some of them since he was a child. He felt he was their equal, and he was not going to stand out in the hallway. Well, for the next 3 months, Mozart's letters from Vienna reflect his almost hysterical hatred of the Archbishop, his demand for greater freedom, and his bitter disappointment at his father's lack of support. But Leopold did not want Wolfgang to leave the Archbishop's service because he knew it would mean a permanent separation between him and his son. And to Wolfgang's dismay, his dad sided with the Archbishop. By May of 1781, things came to a head. He and the Archbishop had a huge fight, with Colloredo calling Mozart all sorts, like a miserable fool, a worthless knave. Mozart handed in his resignation, and it was refused. The following month, permission was finally granted, but in a very insulting way. The composer was dismissed literally with a kick in the rear end, administered by the Archbishop's steward, Count Arco. His boiling rage when he writes about this incident is still palpable today when you read the letters. He says, "Even if I had to go begging, I would never again serve such a lord." Well, he was now 25 and a free man, which meant being a freelance musician. Vienna at that time was in a period of transition as far as the economics of music was concerned. It was part of the changeover from the universal system of private patronage to the beginning of a market system under which the product of the composer and the performer became a commodity that could be bought and sold. So as the royal courts started to disband their private orchestras, musicians had to earn their living in new ways, through giving public concerts of their works, through music lessons, and to selling their scores to the public. Audiences demanded new music, and they generally refused to listen to works written even a decade earlier. Well, this meant that the living composers had to constantly write new works to keep the market supplied, especially works that could be played by amateur musicians in their salons at home. So when at 25, Mozart struck out on his own, he was one of the first musicians to work without the aid of a patron, putting together concerts, soliciting commissions, teaching piano and staging operas. And he loved the freedom of it, at least initially. Shortly after his resignation from Salzburg, Mozart received a major commission for a new opera, The Abduction from the Serai. Well, this opera had everything. Great tunes with trendy Turkish sounding effects, which were all the rage in Vienna. It was a wacky story. There were harems and other exotic attractions and great escape scenes. This was Mozart's first great international success, and it brought in 1,200 florins, which was 3 times his Salzburg salary, though he ended up only seeing 450 of that. The work was repeatedly performed in his lifetime in Europe and brought his genius to the attention of a wider public, despite the famous comment from Emperor Joseph II, who said, "Too fine for our ears, dear Mozart, and an extraordinary number of notes," to which Mozart replied, "Exactly as many notes as are necessary, Your Majesty." Well, in the early Vienna years of 1782 to 1785, Mozart put on a series of concerts in which he appeared as soloist in playing his own piano concertos. He sold subscriptions, and his subscriber list included the cream of Viennese society. These 14 piano concertos are considered one of his greatest achievements and were his primary source of income from 1782 to 1786. So let's have a listen to one of them. Mozart's popularity as pianist and composer reached its peak between 1782 and 1786, and so did his income. His concerts generally sold well, his works were being published, and his name was in all the music publications. He was earning an average of 3,000 to 4,000 florins a year. Now, this was a time when laborers took home 25 florins annually. Now, this would have placed Mozart in Vienna's upper middle class. However, he spent it as fast as he made it on nice clothes for himself and his wife, on lavish entertainment, on servants and copyists. Yes, he probably should have known better, but he figured there was lots of time to make more money, and he composed like mad, sleeping only 5 to 6 hours a night. He wrote on another occasion, quote, "Every minute is precious. I have so much to compose, and not a minute must be lost. I usually go on composing until I am hungry," end quote. Well, often he was still writing the music, like the overture to his opera Don Giovanni, the day before the show, and the musicians had to sight read it, the ink still wet on the page. Around the end of 1785, Mozart moved more toward writing opera music, teaming up with the librettist Lorenzo da Ponte to write 3 of his greatest operas, Don Giovanni, The Marriage of Figaro, and Così fan tutte. Well, they are among the very few operas from this classical era that regularly appear on the program of every opera house still today. In 1787, Mozart finally got his first royal appointment as chamber composer to Emperor Joseph II. It only paid a small salary of about 800 gulden, that's about $35,000 in today's currency, but it also required little work beyond composing some dances for the carnival season. From 1788 to 1790, Mozart's finances took a hit. His wife suffered a series of medical crises that required extended visits to very expensive spas. Changes in musical taste, as well as Austria's expensive involvement in a series of ongoing wars, caused a downturn in commissions. Mozart fell out of favor, and wealthy clients turned their attention elsewhere. The Viennese were a very fickle audience, and he had an extremely hard time selling tickets to his concerts. Mozart embarked on a series of shorter tours to try and raise funds, but they ended in financial failure. His family fell into debt, and Mozart was reduced to begging his friends and his patrons for loans. The letters he wrote pleading for help from 1788 to 1790 are heartbreaking to read, and I've put an excerpt of one of them on the slide. Yet incredibly, he continued to compose as magnificently as ever. His last three symphonies, number 39 to 41, were written over a period of 6 weeks during the summer of 1788. Well, that's faster than a copyist could have copied out the parts. They were not written for a commission or for a concert. As a matter of fact, we don't even know if they were ever performed in his lifetime, and he never once mentions any of them in his copious correspondence. This was just an inner compulsion to create. These symphonies are extraordinary works, each one very different, and they in no way reflect the emotional turmoil that he was in. Mozart would no more have conceived of the genre of symphony as an appropriate outlet for his emotional turmoil than he could have imagined space shuttles or computers. In his time and place, it simply was not how you wrote music. Well, our next excerpt is from his last symphony, nicknamed the Jupiter. It was nicknamed that in the 1820s because of its grandeur. The finale has a fugue that is so complex that one can't even grasp it at first hearing. It's truly an astounding display of polyphony. By late 1790, Mozart was deeply depressed. His health began to deteriorate and his financial problems grew worse. Emperor Joseph had died in February 1790. Mozart pawned his furniture and he borrowed money to travel to the coronation of the new Emperor Leopold in Frankfurt in the hope of playing concerts, of attracting the emperor's notice and getting a position at court, only to be disappointed again. Well, things finally turned around in 1791 when he was commissioned to write an opera in German by Emanuel Schikaneder, who was a well-known actor, singer, and theater director. The opera was aimed at the middle and working class. It was a Singspiel, a German language musical comedy with almost as much spoken dialogue as music. With some help from Mozart, Schikaneder cobbled together the libretto from a book of Oriental fairy tales and called it The Magic Flute. The opera is full of Masonic rituals, symbolism, and iconography. Well, Schikaneder himself sang the role of Papageno, the simple down-to-earth bird catcher. And in this next song, he describes his rustic life and how he wishes that he were equally adept at snaring a mate as he is at snaring birds.
Vogelfänger bin ich, ja, stets lustig heißer Hopsasa. Die Vogelfängerin bekannt, bei alt und jung im ganzen Land. Weiß mit dem Locken umzugehen und mich aufs Pfeifen zu verstehen. Drum kann ich froh und lustig sein, denn alle Vögel sind ja mein.
When the Magic Flute premiered on September 30th, 1791, it was immediately apparent that they had a hit on their hands. By the fall of 1791, Mozart was again in high spirits, and his financial prospects were on the upswing. There was a lucrative offer to compose and perform in England, and he was in line to be the next Kapellmeister at St. Stephen's Cathedral. But it was not to be, however. On November 22nd, 2 days after his last public performance, he unexpectedly took ill with a high fever, headaches, and dramatic swelling in his hands and legs. 2 weeks later, he was vomiting, he had diarrhea, and his body resembled a swollen blimp. Well, despite treatments by some of the best doctors in Vienna, or probably because of those treatments, because those treatments consisted mainly of bloodletting and emetics, Mozart's condition became worse. But he continued composing right to the end, explaining to his pupil Süssmayr, who was at his bedside, how to finish the requiem that he was writing on commission. On December 5th, 15 days after he became ill, Mozart went into convulsions. He lapsed into a coma and he died. He was just 35 years old. Well, Mozart wrote only within the classical genre, but if he had lived as long as Haydn, long enough to hear Beethoven's groundbreaking works, there is no telling what he would have done when assimilating that into his own style. He was constantly exploring and experimenting with new trends, and his genius was in transforming and perfecting every type of musical genre that existed up to that time and turning it into something as close to perfection as it's possible to get. And no other composer before or since has managed to do that. Well, Beethoven was the third of the great classical Viennese composers, and the question often is, did Mozart and Beethoven meet? Well, apparently they did, though there are no eyewitness reports to the meeting. By the time he was 16, the Elector of Cologne was impressed enough by Beethoven's accomplishments to subsidize a trip to Vienna so that he could meet and study with Mozart. Well, no documents survive relating to the meeting of the two great composers. All we have is secondhand anecdotes of uncertain reliability. But Mozart is reported to have been extremely impressed by Beethoven's skill at improvising and to have told bystanders, "Keep your eyes on this one. Someday he will give the world something to talk about." However, within 10 days, Beethoven was headed back to Bonn because his mother was dying. He was born in the smallish German Rhineland city of Bonn in 1770. His dad was a small-time, heavy-drinking court musician who hoped very much that his obviously talented son would become a second Mozart and bring the same financial success to his family. Well, by today's standard, Beethoven had an abusive father. At a very young age, for example, his dad would lock him up in the black damp of the cellar, depriving him of food and beating him when he didn't practice enough. Luckily for posterity, little Ludwig was resilient and stubborn. He didn't end up hating music. It became his escape from the harsh realities of his life, and it also allowed him to dream of a brighter future. As his neighbor Cecilia Fisher recalls, quote, "He was often dirty and unkempt, and when I told him how dirty he looked and that he should be tidier, he answered, 'What difference does it make? When I become a gentleman, no one will notice.'" Christian Neffe was Beethoven's first significant teacher in both piano playing and basic composition. But Ludwig was hard to teach because he didn't respect music traditions. He took from the legacy of his elders only what made sense to him, and he discarded the rest. And that attitude was later to change the course of musical history. Well, back in Bonn, Beethoven established himself as a virtuoso pianist without rivals, and he wrote a substantial number of works in a variety of genres. When Joseph Haydn passed through Bonn in July of 1792, an agreement was reached for Beethoven to go to Vienna to study with Haydn himself. Mozart had died the previous December, and his loss was keenly felt in the city. Vienna was clearly in need of a successor to Mozart, and Haydn probably recognized Beethoven as more likely to fill that role than anyone that he knew in Vienna itself. There were hundreds of professional pianists in Vienna when Ludwig arrived, but he quickly established a reputation as a virtuoso pianist who was especially adept at improvisation. He entered a series of piano duels in which he trounced Vienna's pianists one after another. Beethoven was producing entirely new sounds on the piano by the use of the pedal and partly by a very smooth, legato way of playing the chords, which gave a performance full of romantic feelings and of singing tones. Apparently, his audience would break into loud sobbing because of the effect that his playing had on them, and he rapidly became the darling of the aristocracy, though he was completely lacking in social graces. He was haughty. He refused to learn etiquette. He dressed shoddily, and he insisted on being treated as an equal. As he later said to one of his several royal patrons, "Prince, what you are by circumstances and birth. What I am through myself. Of princes, there have been and will be thousands. Of Beethoven, there is only one." And the nobility ate it up. They loved the fact that he was utterly unfazed by their rank, and they were flattered by his attentions, and he rapidly became the darling of the aristocracy. The leading citizens of the Viennese aristocracy became his patrons, and they provided him with lodging and funds. Well, he continued studying composition with Joseph Haydn, though the two of them rarely saw eye to eye. When he made his public debut on the 29th of March, 1795 at Vienna's Borg Theater, he performed the first piano concerto that he had composed. Now, at that point, the work as a whole is still very much in the generically 18th century style of Mozart. However, 4 years later, by 1799, when he wrote the Pathetique Piano Sonata, he was already showing a level of originality and ingenuity that pointed the way to a new style of music. By 1803, he had written 2 symphonies, a very popular septet that sold loads of copies, and his first 6 string quartets, and he was already being regarded as one of the most important of a generation of young composers following Haydn and Mozart, his music in big demand from patrons and publishers. But as is well known, it was also at that time that Beethoven, only in his mid-20s, discovered that he was going deaf, which is, of course, one of the worst things that can happen to a musician. In April 1802, on the advice of his doctor, Beethoven moved for the summer to the rural village of Heiligenstadt, which is a few miles north of Vienna. The doctor thought that the peace and quiet of the village, as well as the local spa and its waters, might be able to help him. The personal drama Beethoven went through in Heiligenstadt is reflected in an extraordinary letter known today as the Heiligenstadt Testament. Beethoven wrote about his despair at his hearing loss and how he was considering taking his own life. But at the end of the letter, he says that his art held him back from suicide. He writes, it seems to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. I hope my determination will remain firm until it pleases the inexorable fates to break the thread. He could give up, or he could overcome this disability. Well, the premiere of his 3rd symphony, the Eroica, in 1803 made it clear which option he had chosen. This was a complete departure from any symphonies written to date, not to mention twice the length of a Haydn symphony. It was unlike anything heard before, and the reception was mixed. Some hated it, others loved it. The sheer length and concentration of the work made it hard to follow, and at least one member of the audience could not resist shouting, "I'll pay another kreutzer if the thing will but stop." Well, one of the good reviews said, Eroica is one of the most original, most sublime, and most profound products that the entire genre of music has ever exhibited. Well, Mozart himself didn't care what people thought. He said that he was writing for a later age. To an extent which no previous composer had dared dream of, he was writing not for the players of his time, but for beyond the players of his time, for the players of the future. Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies, pushing the boundaries of form, harmonies, and emotional content, and influencing every composer who came after him. Orchestras became bigger, and he even added a choir in the 9th Symphony. It was not just in his orchestral music that Beethoven repeatedly broke new ground. The 32 piano sonatas, which he wrote in bursts throughout his career, used the full expressive range of an instrument that was itself changing rapidly, growing louder, and with an ever greater range of notes. He broke all the rules of the earlier classical era, but not simply for the sake of it. It was always in service of what he wanted to express, whether that was incredible drama or the most intimate personal sentiments. Some of his later works, notably his late string quartets and piano sonatas, use almost no traditional form at all. The melodies are in a state of constant transformation, passing from one idea to the next, like a stream of consciousness. The Große Fuge in his Opus 130 quartet was so far ahead of its time that it still sounds like modern music today. Let's have a quick listen. Well, Beethoven was the predominant composer in the traditional transition period between the classical and the romantic eras. Before Beethoven, there was no romantic era, but after him, very few wanted to write in the classical style anymore. His extraordinary legacy of works changed the face of Western concert music forever. In the course of the 19th century, dead composers began to crowd out the living composers on concert programs, and a canon of masterpieces materialized with Beethoven front and center. Well, our final composer is the Waltz King, Johann Strauss Jr., because in sheer popularity, he and his father outshone all the other composers of Vienna. The Viennese waltz evolved from the popular late 18th century folk dance called the Ländle, which was a boisterous affair in three-quarter time, often accompanied by stomping and hollering. Viennese high society would have seen this dance while they were on their vacations, and they refined it. Couples faced one another in an embrace rather than standing side by side, giving the dance more intimacy and flow. Well, this upscale version became wildly popular, and it played a role in the social diplomacy during the banquets and the balls at the Congress of Vienna in 1814-1815. The catchphrase was, "The Congress is dancing." Well, the whole of Vienna swayed in three-quarter time and became the city of the waltz. And when it came to dance music, the public expected a constant stream of new waltzes and polkas. Joseph Lanner was one of the earliest Viennese composers to expand the waltz from its early rudimentary form by using broader melodies and more daring keys. He formed a string quartet to play in the taverns around Vienna, and by 1824 it had expanded into a small string orchestra. Well, this was so successful that in 1825, he split his group into two small orchestras, putting his viola player and deputy conductor, Johann Strauss, in charge of the second one. In 1825, Strauss realized that he could alleviate his financial struggles by forming his own band and writing his own music. Well, he soon became one of the best-known and well-loved dance composers in Vienna. Strauss established the definitive waltz pattern, If you've ever heard a New Year's concert, you'll know what that is. There's an introduction, there's 5 double waltzes, and then a coda. And he wrote about 250 dance pieces. A lot of pleasant ones, a lot of very famous ones like the Radetzky March, but they weren't particularly inventive. It was his son, Johann Strauss Jr., also known as the Waltz King, who wrote the most famous waltzes like the Blue Danube and the Emperor Waltz, as well as operettas like Die Fledermaus. Strauss Sr. was adamant that none of his sons go into music, despite their obvious talent. When he caught Johann Jr. secretly practicing on the violin one day, he gave him a severe whipping, saying that he was going to beat the music out of the boy. Well, luckily for posterity, Johann Sr. absconded with his mistress, and defiantly, all 3 sons became musicians and composers. The problem for Junior, however, was that the local entertainment establishments were afraid to hire him for fear of angering his father. Eventually, he was able to persuade Dommeyer's Casino in Hietzing, Vienna, to give him a slot, where he debuted in October 1844 when he was just 19. Well, this infuriated Johann Sr., and he never performed there again. Well, it would be nice to say that Johann Jr. was a breakout star that very evening, but he wasn't. His first works were well received, but they didn't set the world on fire. When his father died in 1849, Strauss Jr. merged their 2 orchestras, and he went on tour to Russia and England, establishing his reputation and winning over the audience with his own compositions. He soon quit conducting to focus solely on writing music. The piece that defined Strauss to the public was the Blue Danube, the most famous waltz ever written. However, it was a flop the first time it was performed in 1867. It had been commissioned as a choral work intended to boost Viennese morale after Austria's defeat by Prussia. The choir and the audience really disliked the lyrics, and it was only when it was played as an orchestral piece at the World Exhibition in Paris later that year that it became a sensation. Strauss's publisher received so many orders for the piano score that he had to make 100 new copper plates so that he could print over 1 million copies. Today, it's Austria's 2nd national anthem. Strauss Jr. had a real knack for writing beautiful melodies, and he was respected and befriended by the serious classical composers of his time, people like Brahms and Wagner. In November 2017, UNESCO added the Viennese waltz to the Austrian list of intangible cultural heritage. Well, the Viennese musical tradition has continued for centuries, from one great composer to the next, from the great classical composers to modern composers like Arnold Schoenberg. Vienna's musical heritage is still a very important part of the Austrian culture, and it continues. We'll end by playing the Blue Danube, which is always played at midnight at the New Year's Eve ball. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and we're going to take some questions now. I'm just going to check online to see if any questions have been submitted. So just give me a sec here. I'm going to refresh our page. Okay. There's a surprising Beethoven Museum, Kathleen says, in San Jose State in California. Check it out. Well, that's really interesting. Let's see. Okay. Oh, what happened to Mozart's wife after his death? Well, that's a very good question. When Mozart died, the family still had a lot of debts to pay off. And Constanze, who's often been portrayed as a rather flighty individual, actually turned out to be very adept at managing money and budgeting. So she immediately arranged a series of concerts, benefit concerts for herself. She made sure she collected the commission money owing, for instance, from the Requiem, and she sold more of his works. And by around 1820, she sort of authorized a biography of Mozart, one of the first ones. And it was from her that we get a lot of the memories of him. A lot of them, of course, through a filter now, 35 years difference, and a lot of them rather self-serving for herself. So, and she was the one actually who destroyed a lot of his drafts and music after his death. But she lived quite a long time after him. She did remarry again. They ended up having 2 children. One became a composer, but didn't really amount to anything, and neither of those boys had children. So that line then died out. But yes, she ended up doing quite well financially afterwards. She paid off all the debt and kept his memory alive. So that's what happened to his wife. Okay, now we have breaking up, no sound, but I hope we fix that. Which of Mozart's many compositions would you say are his most popular and are the most played today? Well, definitely in my experience in the Vancouver Symphony, his last 3 symphonies, 39, 40, 41, are played a lot because they are absolutely incredible works. The operas that you see always in the opera houses are his later works, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutti, Magic Flute, those ones, not so much his earlier works. And his chamber music is still incredibly popular. I mean, I have to say almost all of his, especially his later works, are still played in concert halls continually today. And what's interesting for non-musicians to hear sometimes is how very difficult his works are to play. Because when you listen to them, they sound easy. But to actually play Mozart correctly, to give it that light touch and yet infuse it with emotion is extraordinarily difficult, as every musician knows. And in every audition that we do for an orchestra, for instance, for the Vancouver Symphony, you are always required to play a piece by Mozart because that's the real test to show if you are up to standard to join the orchestra. So that's a good question. All right. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. We've been fortunate. Oh, somebody has visited, Tom has visited Salzburg twice, and they've been to Mozart's home. They loved Salzburg. Well, so do I. I used to take groups to Salzburg. We actually went to the Salzburg Festival that they have at the end of August, I believe it was. It's in the Felsen Kirche or the Felsen Hall there. And we had a lot of fun there. I know Mozart hated the city, but my guests and I have always loved going there. Now, it's interesting to Flora from Calgary. Oh, hi, Flora. I'm from Vancouver. Nice to meet you there. It's very interesting to hear that Mozart had to work so hard, and his success was down to a mixture of talent and hard work. Do you think it is possible for anyone to learn how to play a musical instrument if they work hard enough at it and if they are not musical or are tone deaf? Again, a very good question, Flora. It used to be thought that, no, you had to be kind of born with the talent. But then Suzuki came along, the Japanese pedagogue, and his whole theory was that anybody could learn to play an instrument as long as they were given the right instruction. And so he wrote entire books on this. And he also said that children, if you start children young enough, like ages 3 or 4, which is when you start the Suzuki system, you will learn to play. And he's actually right. Everybody can learn to play. If you're tone deaf, and I've had students who are tone deaf, you can actually fix that by joining a choir, for instance, and learning how to recognize pitches. Tone deaf actually doesn't even matter, though, if you're playing the piano, because you just hit a key and there's your note. Where it really matters if you're doing a string instrument like mine or any string instrument, because you have quite a distance, like about this far, to get your note correctly. And you have to be able to hear the note in your head. And then when you hear it coming out of your instrument, those two sounds have to match. So there it's really important to not be tone deaf. But again, you can train yourself. I've sent students who couldn't hear, couldn't really hear whether they were in tune or not. I've sent them to join choirs or to sing along with recordings and stuff, and they started to get very good at being able to hear pitches and know if they were right or wrong. So how did average people of the time hear the music of Haydn and Mozart? Were there public concerts that were affordable? Or was it mainly the upper class that would have been aware of their music? Well, definitely in Haydn, at the beginning of Haydn's time, you would have had to have been an aristocrat who could afford his own orchestra or have been a guest of that aristocrat to be invited to a concert to hear the music of Haydn. Most people played in their homes. So you would have you'd buy the music, the sheet music, for instance, and then you would play piano and somebody else would play violin. And again, it was mainly the upper class who had time to learn these instruments. But as we get later on into Haydn's career, and again, as we get into Mozart's career by the time he's 21, public concert houses started to be built. And then all it took was you to be able to afford the price of a ticket, and then you could go and hear a concert. So again, by this time, middle class, who always wanted to be like the upper class, they started to give their kids music lessons, and they went to concerts themselves. And what I always find astounding is when I read how Mozart could not sell tickets to his concerts. Well, if he only knew today, if he could ever come back, he would have sold out houses every single night. So it's too bad that, that can't be possible. All right, let's see. How do you think Haydn maintained his creativity and inspiration to write compositions despite not having much freedom when he was contracted to the princes for so long? Again, a good question, because Haydn had to write what he was told to write. And so not everything was great, and not everything. As a matter of fact, a lot of his music is not played today because it's, it was fairly standard stuff. But the fact was, he was a great composer, and a great composer can transcend the medium. So like, even if he was forced to, for instance, write a bunch of quartets, he was so good that there was going to be inspiration in those quartets, and there would be greatness in those quartets. But of course, I can't talk to him, so I can't 100% answer how he kept being inspired to write so well. All right, let's see if there's any difference between a violin or viola and a violin. Oh my goodness, Nicole. Well, I could bring up a whole lot of viola jokes at this time, because the viola is considered the red-headed stepchild of the orchestra. We're always told that we're broken down second violinists who went to the viola because we couldn't play violin. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Our instrument is actually harder to play in many ways than a violin. But this whole attitude has led to a whole slew of viola jokes. For instance, the difference between a viola and a violin is that a viola burns longer, stuff like that, which isn't even very funny when you're a viola player. So the actual difference is that a viola is a bigger instrument. I can't give you an exact measurement of how much bigger, because violas differ in size from anywhere from a small 16-inch instrument. Mine is very small because it's about 300 years old. And there's a reason for that, because back then it truly was the case. If you could no longer play violin, you were switched to viola. So you wanted a small instrument so you didn't have to adjust so much. So my very old instrument, 300 years, is a small one. Until you get to the 20th century and you had great violists like Lionel Curtis come up with instruments that were 17 inches long, which are really almost too big to play. Because the instrument is bigger, it is pitched lower. We have an extra string at the bottom called the C string, and our highest string is the A, whereas the violin, the lowest string is the G, and their highest is the E. And because our instrument is bigger, and because the strings are thicker, we have a more sonorous sound. It's a richer, deeper sound. We don't have that brilliant cutting sound that can pierce through the orchestra like the violinists do. So that's why a violist is seldom a solo instrument. There's not many concertos written for viola. So I hope that there's a lot more, but don't want to bore you with that, but hopefully that answers the question. Okay, Kathleen says she was a student in Vienna for an academic year. Oh, lucky for her. 76, 77. Well, that is interesting, Kathleen, because that is about the years that I was studying in Germany. I was in Düsseldorf and Aachen. So really interesting. I wish I could talk to you. But anyway, we went to the Danube to collect some water. He also wanted soil for Mozart's grave. Well, nobody really knows where that grave is. I have taken guests to the cemetery, and we know which cemetery he was buried at, but because he was dumped into what's called a common grave, not a pauper's grave, a common grave, nobody really knows where it is because nobody went out to the cemetery. It was a long and complicated trip on public transportation. It's easier to get from the Viking ship's berth to the city, or is it easier? Well, that I don't know because I don't do the Viking River cruises. I don't know if they put speakers on music on that. I'd love to do one, of course. Let them know you want a music speaker and I'll be there. But I just do the Viking Ocean cruises. So I don't know where Viking berth is in Vienna. One would have to ask that. So as a violist, what is your favorite piece to play with your orchestra? Oh boy, that's always a tough one, a really tough one. Because there's so many great pieces, but my favorite composers overall are the 20th century Russian composers. I love playing Prokofiev and Shostakovich, just fabulous composers. And Stravinsky, one of my absolute favorite pieces is Rite of Spring, because it is so exciting. It's like playing rock music. The rhythms are incredible. The music just wrenches you, it's just so emotional. So that is one of my favorite pieces. So I think that ends our questions today. And again, thank you so much. Oh, maybe I should I do a refresh and just see if there's one more question coming? But I think that's it. No, we're done. Okay. Well, thank you again so much for coming all, and enjoy the rest of your evening or your day, depending on what time zone you're in. And again, yes, I would love to see you all maybe on a Viking cruise one of the days in the future. Thank you so much.